Hello. Um, uh, it's a pleasure to be on this webinar. And what I'll try and do is talk about Brazil for around 30 minutes and then go to questions. And the overall aim is just to give a bit of a summary of Brazil's municipal elections held last Sunday and the possible implications for the Brazilian economy and up to and including presidential elections, which are due in 2026. So if we could go to the first slide, that would be great. Um, I have to confess that I got this slide knowing that it would be almost unseeable, that the writing would be so small that you can't make it out. I can't make it out either. But the reason I put it up there is quite straightforward. The municipal elections were held in about 5,500 cities and municipalities, and they are a complicated procedure which is built into the Brazilian constitution and legislative framework. Um, Over 30 political parties form different kind of alliances to fight the municipal election. So a party might be in an alliance with one set of partners in one part of the country and in an alliance with the others, with other partners in another part of the country. So it is very, very um, risky to make sweeping generalizations, because this really is, this is a very, very local set of alignments. What I will say to kind of try and help you as you look at this is that red municipalities and pink, anything getting close to red, represents a victory for left-wing parties. And as you can see, there are not too many of those. There are quite a few in the northeast of Brazil, which traditionally supports the incumbent president, Luis Inácio Lula da Silva. So very, very short version of what happened is that the left did pretty badly in the municipal elections. Um, on the other hand, sort of yellowish brownish, which you can see particularly strong on the left-hand side of this map of Brazil, represents the right and the far right, and various hues of blue represent center parties. So again, a very kind of summarized view is that the election results were good for the center and the center right, and perhaps okay for, at least from this picture, okay for the far right, which has become active in Brazil in recent years. I should also say that the system works such that if no candidate for mayor or municipal councillor gets past 50% of the vote, there will have to be a second round ballot. So that second round ballot in about 50 cities is going to be held on the 27th of October. I think we have enough information to perhaps not predict exactly how the second round will go, but to say that it will follow the general trend that has been shown on the first round. If we could go to the next slide, please. Here's a look at some of the top cities in Brazil, and essentially blue are municipal candidates and candidates for mayor who've been endorsed by the far right. So these are candidates who have the support of former President Jair Bolsonaro, who is in office from 2019 to 23, who is at some level a kind of Trump-like figure. He's very much he's presented himself as now. His situation is complex. After the end of his presidency, he faced and faces multiple allegations of corruption, anti-democratic behavior, conflict of interest, and a bit like Trump, he's got a whole procession of these cases going through the courts. He's already been convicted. He's been found guilty and convicted on one of those cases, which was to have acted a way to undermine democracy. And the sentence included a ban on him holding public office until 2030. So what this means is that Bolsonaro is not a candidate in the 2026 presidential race, and he's, if you like, trying to play the role of kingmaker, saying he will endorse or not endorse certain candidates. So the color code shows that Bolsonaro endorsed candidates are blue, so they are there are a lot of them, and they have a significant proportion of the vote. Lula endorsed candidates are red, and again we see that they have done less well than Bolsonaro endorsed candidates. Where the grey in these bars represent candidates who have been neither endorsed by Bolsonaro nor by Lula. So I think most of the little bars on this graph show that they cover elections about to take place in the second round. There's only a few of them which have actually won and resolved on the first round. So if we could have the next slide, please. The interesting thing here is that control of Brazil's cities and municipalities is very significant in political terms, but kind of follows its own logic, which doesn't necessarily match up with national political trends. And this is, in fact, a reflection of the fact that the municipal elections are largely determined on local issues and local candidates and local alliances. It makes it very difficult to generalize for the country as a whole. But what I need to point out here is that although it's hard to see it on the portion of the graphs that are shown here, the party that got most municipalities overall, which in fact it won, of the ones available, it won 878 municipalities, is the PSD, which is on the middle of the top row. And it's a basically centrist party which has gathered strength very much at local level and will therefore become a significant player. Additionally, these municipal elections were dominated by the MDB, the Brazilian Democratic Movement, a centrist party. But as you can see there on the top left-hand corner, its strength has been decreasing in the last few municipal elections. The municipal elections are held every 4 years. So I think, yes, if we could go to the next slide. Right, now this is even more difficult to read. It's also quite significant. Although if we go by the number of municipalities won, I was mentioning the PSD centrist party has won most. Sorry, PSD on the right has won most, followed by MDB, which is centrist. And you get down until the fifth most voted is the Liberal Party, which, contrary to what the name indicates, is actually a far right party under Bolsonaro. So what seems to have happened in this particular use of numbers from the electoral authority, what seems to have happened is that the Liberal Party, Bolsonaro's party, actually had a very strong election. It received the votes of 15.7 million Brazilians in different parts of the country. That's the aggregation. It was followed in second place by the PSD, which also performed well with 4.8 million. Third place by the centrist MDB, which got, if I screw up my eyes, 14.4 million. União Brasil, a right-wing party, 11.3 million. So basically what we're saying is that if you look at the map of political control, which in the different municipalities, which was the first we showed, you get one sort of answer. If you look at how many votes were cast, another answer, and on number of votes cast, the far right PL has done very well. That doesn't necessarily mean you can project from there to state and national elections, because again, local elections, local issues, they don't necessarily all fit through. So if we go to the next slide, another, if you like, input into the mystery that is Brazilian politics is to look briefly at how the Lula government is doing. And as in many things, it depends very much on your viewpoint. So it's evident that support for Lula has been waning. Less people approve of his government. More think that he's not doing as well as he should. And when I said it is relative to your opinion, to your position, you say, how does this look for a president that's halfway through a 4-year term? How does it look at the 2-year point? The answer is it isn't that bad. All governments tend to lose support as they go along, and Lula has, been gently losing support. If you, however, look at it from the point of view of an opposition politician in Brazil, it represents a clear opportunity. Lula's getting less popular. This has got to be an opportunity for us. It's also interesting in the second chart on this slide that although, again, from a comparative point of view, Lula has been managing the economy quite well. He's had 2 years of growth, getting close to 3%. Inflation is at 4%. It's been brought down. So you can make the argument that his management of the economy has been good. It's also true, so it seems from this graph, that the bulk of the population don't necessarily feel it. So the proportion of people who believe the economy has done badly in the last 12 months has climbed up to 41%. That is basically a political problem for him, since Brazil is at best going to continue growing in the 2-3% range. The question becomes, after another 2 years, will he be vulnerable as we head towards the 2026 election? So if we can have the next slide. I've come up with 8 early conclusions, 8 messages from Sunday's election, but I should put a health warning on it first of all, that I may say contradictory things in looking at these 8 early conclusions, partly because Brazilian politics allows for differing interpretations of what's going on, but I'll try and explain that. Now, for me, the most important headline is that Brazilian politics are boring. This is not a terribly good way of selling this particular webinar, but bear with me. They are in a boring stage, and the argument I would make to you is that this is a positive thing, or it reflects positive change in Brazil. So, absolutely critical point to make here is that the 2024 municipal elections went ahead without major incident. And in sharp contrast, the presidential elections of 2022, there was nobody contesting the validity of the election result. If you go back to 22 in Brazil, it was having a Donald Trump moment when Bolsonaro was saying, at the end of my presidency, if the election count shows me losing, it will almost by definition be fraudulent. There is a massive fraud being prepared by forces of the left against me. And a lot of that is based on attacks from Bolsonaro and his supporters on the electronic voting system, which has been in operation in Brazil for about 20, 25 years. So the key point to make about elections being boring in this time around in 2024 is that there were no challenges to the results. Some may still emerge, but so far there've been no challenges to the results. And the Liberal Party, the far right party, has done quite well out of the elections and is not questioning the voting process that got you there. So just to pursue the boring, the allegation of boring elections a little bit further, you could say that Latin America is a bit politically extreme. Strange and bizarre things often happen. We're in a continent where, to the south of Brazil, the current president of Argentina won the elections with a chainsaw, which he held up as a sign of how he'd cut back government spending. We're dealing with, to the west of Brazil, Peru, which has pretty much had one president per year because of continual impeachment procedures, and there's a very high level of drama, for want of a better word. If you look to the north, to Mexico, there's judicial reform going ahead, which proposes directly elected judges, and which has led to a long-running strike by workers in the judiciary and high controversy. So in that general environment, I'd argue that the Brazilian municipal elections represent the working of the correct functioning of democratic checks and balances, and of negotiations and alliances and deal making, which is, if you like, the stuff of everyday democracy, and that seems to be working well. My second headline: the elections were a win for the centre right. I think you have to come to that conclusion simply, although you can look at different ways of counting the vote. The fact is that the parties of the centre right have won more municipalities and towns than anyone else, and they are now in a key position looking at 2026. So essentially what happens is the municipal elections are not directly connected. For example, that there are no congressional elections at the moment. The municipal elections are what they say on the tin. They are local, but those wins do give some opportunity for parties to build their infrastructure and resources using the municipalities where they've won. So some of this is legitimate, some of it might not be legitimate, but money does find its way. If you control a lot of municipalities, it is likely that money will find its way into funding your political party and putting it in a good position to negotiate support ahead of next year's elections. So that's a rather diplomatic way of saying that Brazilian politics are based on pork barrel political agreements, and the centre-right parties, having won more municipalities, will be in a position to strengthen their preparations for the 2026 presidential elections. If we turn to headline 3, the impact on the far right, it has, as we've seen, it's still there. It's still quite powerful. It has lots of people who are prepared to vote for it, but it has a significant leadership issue. And that leadership issue is that Bolsonaro, the former president, can't run for elections next time round, and is playing this game of trying to be the kingmaker of people within his own party and within allied right-wing parties who might form a coalition looking at 2026. It's difficult and complicated because I suppose Bolsonaro, like a far-right leader in alliance with center-right parties to forward, where many in those center-right parties would like to run the show and have an alliance with the far right in a much more junior and subordinate role. And that kind of battle, who will control the right wing of the Brazilian political spectrum, will probably step up in the next few months. I should say quickly that the city of Sao Paulo had basically a battle between the right and the left, with the right supported by Bolsonaro, and with a far right, if you like, an outsider candidate called Pablo Marçal, who came from nowhere and sees more than 1/5 of the vote. So there will be a runoff in Sao Paulo, which will be, if you like, a classic alignment between the right and the left, and that does reflect how, at one level, Brazilian politics remain very polarized. It also needs to be mentioned that not everything went in Bolsonaro's favor. His party and his family has traditionally been based in Rio de Janeiro, and they lost there by a landslide. There's a centrist party, Eduardo Paes, who won with over 60% of the vote. So none of the major parties can claim that everything has gone their way. Headline 4, the left has been weakened by Lula's ebbing popularity. That's true, but he still remains in play. He hasn't quite ruled out, or he hasn't quite decided whether he'll run for a 4th presidential term in 2026, or whether he might endorse a much younger left-winger, such as the candidate for the number 2 candidate for the mayor of Sao Paulo, Guilherme Boulos, who could be a standard bearer for the left in the future. Headline 5, the government will follow mainstream economic policies for the next 2 years. This is, I think, what I was saying earlier about checks and balances, how it seems to work. Lula is a left-winger. He would like to increase spending. He would like to do more to help the poor. He would like to, even reverse privatizations and increase public sector ownership. But he completely lacks a majority in the Congress. He has, and in effect, his ministerial team has allied parties, both of the left and of the center-right, involved. So the way he is governing, you could say he's a left-wing president who is having to govern in a centrist manner just to get things through Congress. And in that sense, you can say democratic checks and balances are working. The economic policy that is being followed is a moderate economic policy. It's got some points that are critical. A number of economists believe that the fiscal deficit remains too large, and the government hasn't done enough to cut it back. There's a debate that's going on about the right level of interest rates, but this is fundamentally an economic policy that is limited or shaped by the political alignments in the country. There is a possibility, and this is where I may be contradictory in what I'm saying. There are 2 different scenarios which are worth considering, and I think both are possible. It will depend which way it goes. So one is that relations with Congress, between Lula's government and the right-wing dominated Congress, will become more tense, limited reforms. Another directly opposed view is that because right-wing parties have done well in the elections, they will be happy and willing to negotiate new deals with the government on issues of economic policy, on further tax reform, or on other policies that that are coming up over the following months. So, a question mark there. In a sense, Lula had an opportunity to reach a new agreement with parties after the municipal elections, but it isn't. But success is guaranteed. Headline 7. If you look at all these political forces in play and the government economic policies, I think the conclusion is quite a positive one, that GDP growth will be in the 2 to 3% range. Inflation, which got as high as 7-8%, has now been brought down to 4%. And that, if you like, from the perspective of a foreign investor in Brazil, that's a good story. It is the largest economy in Latin America, and the outlook for it is that it will continue a pathway of moderate growth, which is very positive. Which I should say has been reflected by Moody's, the rating agency, which recently upgraded Brazil's credit score from BA2 to BA2 from BA1. The positive outlook. So it basically said, I'm looking for the quote, the reason for the upgrade is the positive effect of structural reforms implemented over successive administrations related to a range of policy areas. So again, nothing dramatic, a process of gradual incremental improvement, but which seems to have a degree of resilience looking forward, which is good news all round. Lastly, my last headline is that the governor of São Paulo state, a right-winger called Tarcísio de Freitas, previously infrastructure minister under Bolsonaro, continues to position himself as a potential presidential winner in 2026. The candidate he endorsed for São Paulo is ahead of the race. So there's major politicians, if you like to be associated with winners, and that's why both Lula and Bolsonaro have been careful with who they choose to endorse. But apart from mentioning Tarcísio de Freitas as a candidate, I think it has to be said that there are a lot of other people in the running. There's Romeu Zema, the governor of Minas Gerais state, Eduardo Leite, the governor of Rio Grande do Sul. There's within the government, there's Simone Tebet, a centrist, who's the current planning minister, who is younger, as a lot of these people are in their 40s, than the people like Lula and like Bolsonaro. So at this stage, obviously the presidential race has a way to go. It happens in 2 years, but in Brazil they're always thinking of the next presidency. I think the summary of it is the country will not lack good candidates to make a run for the presidency, and it will all depend on the alliances that can be struck. I think that's my 30 minutes done. I'm very happy to try and answer any question.
Thank you very much. I wonder, Andrew, first of all, whether perhaps you would say something about Brazilian foreign policy, both under Lula and also perhaps where you think it's going to be going in the future.
Yes, that's an interesting question. I think the essential answer is that Brazil feels undervalued in world politics. There's a traditional feeling that goes across the political spectrum, that it kind of somehow hasn't given the importance it deserves in terms of the size of its population and its economy, and that it's, for example, should have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. There should be reform, and particularly under Lula, who, after all, has dominated the first 20 years of this century. He has sought to associate the country with what is often called the global south, always clearly defined, but you could say the global south, non-alignment, support for a multipolar rather than unipolar world. And while Brazil is very definitely a democracy in the Western tradition, what he has chosen to do is to take a step, if you like, away from the traditional policies of Western powers and assert Brazil's sort of independent stance. So he's done this in various ways, some more successful than others. Perhaps most controversially within Brazil, he has refused to condemn the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, saying that he wants to remain impartial between the two sides, so that Brazil and other countries can play the role of peace brokers. So he said, I'm not condemning, he's kind of treated them on a moral equivalence, which is much opposed by the center-right Brazil. He has been involved in a Brazilian-Chinese peace plan, which, as far as I know, is very detailed, but is a kind of an attempt to mark out a role for the global South in trying to resolve such disputes. And he will probably continue. Ukraine has dismissed this peace plan as basically a pro-Putin ploy. So progress on that has not been very strong. He's also condemned Israel, accused it of major contravention of international law in the conflict over the Gaza Strip and now the south of Lebanon. So he's been kind of outside the Western consensus on that. And he's also often criticized for trying to follow what you might call a third way, an independent policy in relations inside Latin America. Most notoriously, he has sought to, he's traditionally sought to support Venezuela, run by an authoritarian left regime under Nicolás Maduro. He's kind of shown some frustration with Venezuela, said, you must come up, you must come up with believable election results. This relates to presidential election in Venezuela, which was widely seen as being fraudulent. And again, most Latin American countries have condemned Venezuela for rigging the elections. But a group of left-wingers, the presidents of Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, have kind of taken a slightly more softer approach. Whereas the other countries refuse to recognize Maduro as the legitimate president of Venezuela, Lula has recognized him as such and says you must work for some sort of a political settlement. So I suppose there are a number of other issues that are worth mentioning that are part of this general approach. Brazil has become, certainly under Lula, and in contrast to Bolsonaro, a supporter of climate change action and of a response to global warming, which includes reduction of deforestation, an energy transition, and a whole series of changes of that kind. Now, while he's made that point very, very publicly and very proactively, Brazil still continues to produce fossil fuels, oil and gas. And in fact, based on recent discoveries and possibilities, Brazil could be a major oil and gas producer for the next 20, 30 years. Lula's approach is we need all these. It's sustainable energy, renewable energy, and oil and gas, not instead of oil and gas.
Yeah.
So his view of the transition is that it will be gradual over many years, and that you can still produce fossil fuels during that period. That's controversial to some extent within his own cabinet, where the environment minister, Marina Silva, is, if you like, more proactive on reducing oil and gas investments, particularly in exploration in the mouth of the Amazon, which is a environmentally fragile and an important area. Whereas his mines and energy minister is drumming up new investment and says that you have to invest in oil and gas to be able to fund the development of alternative technologies.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking to experts in Suriname, and they were saying that there is and we'll be looking at a Suriname website webinar perhaps in January, and they were saying that for northeast Brazil, Suriname could become very important, and the relationship between Brazil and Suriname is increasing all the time. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
I think there's two, as far as I understand it, there are two ways in which this connection is important. One is that because of offshore oil finds in Guyana and Suriname, it may be that there are contiguous areas of Brazil which will experience similar positive discoveries and will independently, if you like, boost regional economic growth for Brazil in an area that's often been neglected. The other possible interpretation or angle is that the development of the oil industry in Suriname and Guyana will have positive impacts for companies operating out of Brazil. There will be oil and gas collaboration of different types, if you like, open up the region. I think it's important to note that Lula has traditionally been, apologies, I have loud dogs. Lula has traditionally been supported electorally by the impoverished northeast of Brazil. So he is always on the lookout for things that will help local development, create jobs in a sort of an often neglected part of the country. And the offer of new jobs, I suspect, may trump the protection of the environment when it comes to decisions that need to be taken. Charles, I've lost the audio.
My fault. I'd muted temporarily. In terms of business opportunities for Western companies, banks, insurance companies, etc., I wonder whether you could say something about that for Western companies operating in Brazil or who want to work there.
I think again, it's in some degree similar to what we were saying about the energy industry and opportunities. Brazil is the largest economy in Latin America, 220 million people in its population, and it has reached a relatively sophisticated. It's a developing economy still, but it has reached a quite sophisticated level of economic development. So that means that there are a lot of international companies interested in taking up in Brazil. There's a large automobile industry. There's a an space industry that's quite significant. There is a very, very large financial sector. There's a bit of a boom in financial technology going on. Brazil has a lot of startups that are dealing with different ways of making credit card payments and moving money around. It's an economy in which a lot is happening, and although a 2% growth rate may not be spectacular, translated to particular industries, that does create very significant opportunities. The government, particularly the Lula government, if you like, adopts a left position on a whole range of economic issues, and would like to see, has made some advances in poverty reduction and in reduction of inequality, but seems to be very, very clear that it wants to attract foreign investment. So it's even though Lula is a left-wing leader, there is no doubt that he, like the way he sees the world is that it is politically deeply attractive to bring in new foreign investment into the country, and he will perhaps quibble over the terms of that investment. To give you an example, he's recently been talking about artificial intelligence, AI, and says he wants to help set up an AI sector in Brazil, as he put it, so that we can use things we have developed here rather than having to import them at paying a high price. So there's this traditional idea that he wants to develop the economy, get a high rate of growth, and attract business to Brazil, which will include provisions on local content, will include employing but also training local people, and possible will include exporting as well. So if you like, Brazil wants its share of value added.
Okay. We have a question here on the non-aligned movement and the resurgence of it and Brazil's role within it. Do you think we're likely to go back to the non-aligned movement of the 1980s, where it was quite a strong organization?
I do think there's definitely interest in it, but whether it will be successful is not clear. Things have changed since the non-alignment of the 70s and perhaps the 80s. And if you like, one interesting sort of imbalance is that the BRICS movement is expanding and has invited more people in. One of its members is China, and China is now one of the world's largest economies. And I would sort of argue you could describe China as more of a superpower, which is battling for market share globally with the United States, as being an unaligned country. So in some senses, I think you need a redefinition of what being non-aligned really means. I think to some extent it's to do with multipolarity and avoiding poorer countries having forcibly to align with Washington or Beijing. And I think Brazil will make some progress on that front, but it will be less than it wants, and it will take longer than Lula and others feel would be required.
Okay, I think that's all for now. So thank you very much indeed, Andrew.